The sound of breaking ceramic in a silent house is a death knell when you're a kid who can't see the mess you've made. For 11-year-old Ethan, the world was a map of textures and echoes, a delicate geography he navigated with a hand on the wall and a prayer in his heart. But tonight, the geography failed him. It was a simple Tuesday in the suburbs of Ohio, the kind of humid evening where the air feels like a wet blanket. Ethan had reached for a glass of water on the kitchen island, his fingers brushing against something smooth, something expensive. Karen's favorite hand-painted stoneware pitcher, a souvenir from a trip to Napa Valley she never let him forget. Crash. The explosion of clay against the linoleum floor sounded like a gunshot. In the sudden ringing silence, Ethan froze. He could feel the jagged energy of the shards scattered around his sneakers. Then came the footsteps, sharp, rhythmic, and heavy. Karen, Ethan Miller, tell me you didn't. Her voice wasn't loud, it was cold, the kind of cold that freezes the marrow in your bones. I'm sorry, Karen, I just wanted some water. I'll clean it up, I promise, Ethan stammered, his hands trembling as he reached out instinctively. Clean it up? You'll just cut yourself and bleed all over my floor, making an even bigger mess for me to fix, she snapped. He heard her heels click closer, then the harsh scrape of a chair. You're just like your father, leaving me with nothing but broken things and bills. I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up to be a live-in nurse for a kid who can't even walk to the sink. In the corner of the kitchen, a soft, low whine vibrated through the floorboards. Buddy, a golden-furred Labrador with a heart of pure loyalty, moved toward Ethan. Buddy had been his shadow for 4 years, 2 years with his dad and 2 years since the cancer took him. His dad had spent those final months not in a hospital bed, but in the backyard whispering commands to Buddy, teaching the dog to be the eyes he knew he wouldn't be able to provide. Don't you dare let that animal touch those shards, Karen hissed. Ethan felt the familiar weight of Buddy's head rest against his knee. It was the check-in, the command his dad had taught Buddy to reassure Ethan when the world felt too loud. I'm here. You're okay? But they weren't okay. You know what? Karen's voice was suddenly airy, detached. I'm done. I've spent 2 years trying to turn a tragedy into a life, but you're a constant reminder of a man who left me with a mortgage and a handicap. Pack your bag. Now. It's raining outside, Karen, Ethan whispered, the sound of the Midwestern thunderstorm finally registering, a low rumble of thunder that shook the window panes. Then I suggest you find an umbrella. You've got 5 minutes before I lock the deadbolt. And take that mutt with you. He's the only thing in this house that actually listens to you anyway. 10 minutes later, Ethan stood on the gravel driveway, the strap of a soaked North Face backpack digging into his shoulder. The rain was a deluge now, a mid-July gully washer, his dad used to call it. He couldn't see the porch light go out, but he heard the heavy clack of the electronic lock. He was 11. He was blind, and he was standing in a storm with nothing but a dog and a memory. Buddy, Ethan sobbed, the wind whipping his hair across his face. What do we do? Buddy didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. The dog stepped forward, the leather harness Ethan's dad had custom-made creaking slightly. Buddy gave a sharp, confident tug on the lead. He wasn't pulling toward the street or the neighbors' houses. He was turning toward the woods, toward the old trail that led to the ridge, a place Ethan hadn't been allowed to go since his father died. Buddy knew a secret. He had a final command to fulfill, one that had been etched into his DNA by a dying man who loved his son enough to plan for the worst. The mud of the Ohio backcountry didn't just stick, it swallowed. Every step Ethan took felt like he was walking through wet concrete. The rain was no longer just a gully washer. It had transformed into a relentless, rhythmic drumming against his skull, drowning out the world. In the suburbs, sound was a tool. He could hear the hum of a refrigerator, the distant whine of a lawnmower, or the click of a neighbor's mailbox. But out here, in the dense thicket of the Buckeye State's woods, the acoustics were a chaotic mess of splashing water and wind-whipped branches. "Buddy, slow down," Ethan gasped, his voice thin and brittle. He gripped the leather harness so hard his knuckles felt like they might burst through his skin. Buddy didn't slow down. The Labrador's breathing was heavy but steady, a mechanical rhythm that was the only thing keeping Ethan from a total panic attack. They weren't on a paved sidewalk anymore. The ground beneath Ethan's soaked vans was a treacherous incline of slick limestone and rotted oak leaves. This was the Old Ridge Road, an unmaintained logging trail that local legends claimed was haunted. But to Ethan, it wasn't ghosts he feared. It was the very real possibility of a 50-foot drop into the creek bed below. "Dad, why did you teach him this?" Ethan whispered, a sob catching in his throat. He remembered a Saturday 3 years ago, back when the air didn't smell like grief. His dad had been particularly insistent that day. "Ethan, listen to the bells, buddy," he'd said, his voice already raspy from the first rounds of chemo. He had tied 3 different pitched wind chimes to specific trees along this very path. "If you ever lose your way, the wind will tell you where the shelter is." Suddenly, Buddy stopped dead. Ethan stumbled into the dog's wet flank, nearly overbalancing. "What is it? What's wrong?" The dog let out a low, vibrating growl. It wasn't the sound he made at a mailman. It was the sound of a protector facing a threat. Then Ethan heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of rushing water, a lot of it. The creek at the bottom of the hollow had turned into a flash flood, and it was roaring like a freight train right in their path. "We can't cross that, Buddy. We'll be swept away," Ethan cried, the terror finally breaking through his defenses. He thought of Karen, probably sitting in her climate-controlled living room right now, a glass of Chardonnay in hand, while he was about to be erased by a forest he couldn't see. Buddy huffed a sharp exhale of dog breath against Ethan's hand, and then did something he had never done during their training. He nudged Ethan's hand away from the harness handle and tucked his head under Ethan's arm, forcing the boy to lean his entire weight onto him. Then, instead of going forward toward the roar of the water, Buddy began to lead him sideways, up an even steeper embankment. They were bushwhacking. Thorny multiflora rose bushes tore at Ethan's damp jeans, and the branches of weeping willows slapped his face like wet fingers. He felt small, insignificant, and utterly lost. This was the middle of nowhere, the vast, unforgiving American wilderness that had claimed better men than an 11-year-old boy. But then the sound changed. The roar of the creek grew muffled, blocked by something solid. The wind, which had been whipping in every direction, suddenly died down. Ethan felt the ground level out. It wasn't mud anymore. It was gravel, crushed limestone, the kind his dad used to buy by the truckload for the driveway. Buddy's pace quickened. He wasn't just walking, he was trotting. "Buddy, wait, I can't." Ethan's foot hit something hard. Wood. A porch. He reached out his left hand, his fingers trembling, and touched a surface that wasn't a tree. It was corrugated metal, the siding of a shipping container. He followed the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His fingers found a heavy steel handle, the kind you'd see on a walk-in freezer or a high-security shed. Next to the handle, there was a small plastic box. Ethan fumbled with it, his fingers numb from the cold. It was a keypad. 0722, a voice echoed in his mind. His dad's birthday, July 22nd. Ethan pressed the buttons, the mechanical beep, 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 sounding like a choir of angels in the storm. There was a heavy motorized clunk. The seal of the door hissed, releasing a puff of air that smelled like cedar shavings, old flannel, and gun oil. It was the smell of his father. Buddy didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and gently tugged Ethan inside. As soon as Ethan's heels cleared the threshold, Buddy turned and nudged the door shut. The heavy steel thud silenced the storm instantly. The silence was deafening. No rain, no wind, just the sound of Ethan's own ragged breathing and the thud-thud-thud of Buddy shaking the water off his coat. Ethan reached out, his hands searching the darkness of the room. He felt a workbench, a stack of wool blankets, and a row of canned goods. His hand brushed against a small, battery-operated lantern. He found the switch and flipped it. Even though he couldn't see the light fill the room, he felt the warmth of it on his skin. This wasn't just a shed. This was a bunker, a prepper's sanctuary tucked into the side of the Ohio hills, built by a man who knew his time was short and his son's challenges were great. "We made it," Ethan whispered, collapsing onto a pile of blankets. "We actually made it." But as he sat there, the adrenaline fading into a bone-deep exhaustion, he realized this was only the beginning. He was miles from civilization, hidden in a hole in the ground, and the woman who was supposed to love him had thrown him away like trash. Buddy came over and slumped his heavy, wet body across Ethan's lap, a silent promise of protection. Ethan buried his face in the dog's fur and wept, not for the broken pitcher or the cold rain, but for the man who had loved him enough to build a world in the dark. The air inside the bunker was still, thick with the scent of pine sol, dry earth, and the faint metallic tang of a backup generator. For the first time in hours, Ethan's ears weren't ringing from the assault of the storm. The silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. "Buddy, you still there?" Ethan whispered. A soft thump-thump of a tail against the plywood floor was his answer. Buddy was exhausted, his coat matted with the gray clay of the Ohio Valley, but he remained an anchor. Ethan began to crawl, his hands sweeping across the floorboards until they hit the leg of a heavy oak desk, a piece of furniture that felt out of place in a steel shipping container. As he pulled himself up, his fingers brushed against a row of tactile labels. Braille. His heart skipped. His dad had spent months learning the basic grade 1 Braille before the end, his fingertips calloused from work but his spirit determined. Ethan's fingers danced over the bumps on the top drawer. Lesten. He pulled the drawer open. Inside was something plastic and rectangular, a handheld digital recorder, the kind his dad used to dictate notes for his construction business. Attached to it with a rubber band was a single tactile button glued to the play icon. Ethan's breath hitched. He sat on the floor back against the cold steel wall and pressed it. There was a hiss of static, a cough, and then the voice. It was gravelly, worn thin by the chemo, but it was unmistakably him. "Hey, Peanut. If you're hearing this, it means Buddy did his job. It means the world got a little too loud and you needed a place to disappear for a while. I'm sorry I'm not there to open the door for you, kiddo. I really am." Ethan choked back a sob, pressing the recorder against his ear as if he could merge with the sound waves. "I know you're scared. I know, Karen. Well, I know it hasn't been easy. But this place, this is the fortress. It's off-grid, solar-powered, and stocked for a long winter. Under the desk, you'll find a cooler. Inside is a sandwich. Well, probably just the fixings by now, and some Gatorade. Drink up. You need your strength because tomorrow we start your training." The recording clicked off. Ethan felt a strange mix of crushing grief and a sudden, sharp spark of purpose. He reached under the desk and found the small igloo cooler. Inside, just as promised, were vacuum-sealed packs of beef jerky, peanut butter, and a bottle of blue Gatorade. His favorite. It was a prepper's picnic, a bittersweet meal prepared by a ghost. As he ate, Ethan's hands continued to explore his new reality. To his left, a wall of shelves held the inventory. Each shelf had a braille strip. Canned goods, protein, canned goods, veggies, first aid, batteries. His dad hadn't just built a room, he had built a tactile map of survival. But it wasn't just about food. As Ethan moved toward the back of the bunker, Buddy suddenly nudged his hand toward a specific spot on the wall. There was a cord hanging there. Ethan pulled it, and a low hum filled the room, the sound of an air filtration system. Part 2. The recorder chirped when Ethan hit play again. Look, Ethan, this isn't just a hiding spot, it's a school. In the bottom drawer of the desk, there's a tactile map of the 3-acre woods surrounding this bunker. I've buried supply caches at different points. Every day you and Buddy are going to go out and find one. It's a game of search and rescue, just like we practiced in the backyard. Except now the prize is your future. Ethan ran his fingers over the bottom drawer. He pulled out a large, heavy board. It was a 3D topographical map of the ridge. He could feel the creek, a carved groove, the bunker, a raised metal square, and several X marks made of rough sandpaper. His father knew the world would try to sideline a blind boy. He knew people like Karen would see a handicap instead of a human. So, he had turned the Ohio wilderness into a giant tactile puzzle. He had turned Buddy into a living GPS. He wasn't just teaching you to lead me home. Was he, Buddy? Ethan whispered into the dark. He was teaching us how to hunt. Buddy let out a sharp, affirmative bark that echoed off the metal walls. For the first time since the pitcher shattered on the kitchen floor, Ethan didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a protagonist. He reached out and found a warm, wool Hudson Bay blanket on the cot. He curled up, the smell of the wool, damp and earthy, reminding him of camping trips in the Hocking Hills. Outside, the storm continued to howl, a Midwestern monster tearing at the trees. But inside the steel heart of the hill, a blind boy and his dog were no longer running. They were digging in. Ethan fell asleep to the sound of his father's recorded breathing, a rhythmic ghost loop that promised one thing. Tomorrow, we work. The dream ended with the sound of a dying heartbeat, or at least that's what it felt like. Ethan woke up to a rhythmic, electronic chirping, thin and desperate. It was the low-voltage alarm from the solar inverter. In the pitch blackness of the bunker, the silence had been replaced by a faint electrical hum that was rapidly losing its pitch. "Buddy, wake up!" Ethan croaked, his throat feeling like he'd swallowed a handful of Ohio dust. The dog was already on his feet, his nails clicking against the plywood floor. Ethan reached out for the digital recorder on the desk, his fingers fumbling until he hit the next saved track. "All right, Ethan, real talk," his dad's voice crackled. The recording sounded older, the background noise filled with the beep of a hospital monitor. "The bunker is a tank, but the solar panels are its Achilles heel. If a storm is bad enough, branches from the old sugar maples will sag onto the roof. If they block the cells or tear a wire, the batteries will drain. If that happens, the air scrubber stops. The pump for the well stops. You have to keep those panels clear. It's the only rule you can't break." Ethan felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He wasn't just a guest here, he was the caretaker. He found the external maintenance kit his dad had labeled in braille near the door. Inside was a collapsible pole with a rubber hook and a pair of heavy-duty work gloves. He pulled on his damp North Face jacket, the cold fabric making him shiver, and felt Buddy press against his leg. "We have to go up there, don't we?" They stepped out of the heavy steel door. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle, but the wind was still whipping through the hollow, making the trees groan like old floorboards. Ethan felt for the ladder, a series of rebar rungs welded directly into the side of the shipping container. He tucked the pole into the strap of his backpack and began to climb. Every rung felt like an ice cube. His fingers ached, the tips turning numb despite the gloves. Buddy stayed at the base, letting out a sharp, anxious yelp every few seconds to give Ethan a sound anchor. When Ethan reached the top, the wind hit him full force, nearly bailing him over the side. He dropped to his knees, his hands searching the flat, textured surface of the roof. He felt the cold, glass-like smoothness of the solar panels. And then he felt the heavy, wet weight of a fallen limb. It was a massive branch from a nearby oak, slick with moss and rain. It was pinned across the primary array. "Okay, Dad, I'm here. Now what?" Ethan whispered into the wind. He pulled out the collapsible pole, extending it until it clicked. He reached out, sweeping the pole across the roof until it caught on the rough bark of the branch. He pulled. Nothing. The limb was wedged under a mounting bracket. Ethan crawled closer, his heart hammering. He was 12 feet off the ground, blind, on a wet metal roof in the middle of a forest. One wrong move and he'd be a broken heap in the mud, and Buddy would be left guarding a body. "Focus on the tension, Ethan." His dad's voice echoed from a memory of a weekend project long ago. "Don't just pull. Wiggle it. Find the leverage." Ethan adjusted his grip. He wedged the hook under the thickest part of the branch and began to rock it back and forth. Screech. Scrape. The sound of wood on metal was deafening. He poured every ounce of his 90-pound frame into a final, desperate shove. The branch gave way with a sickening crack, sliding off the edge of the container and crashing into the undergrowth below. Almost instantly, the faint, high-pitched alarm from inside the bunker ceased. The hum of the inverter returned to a healthy, low-frequency thrum. Ethan collapsed onto his stomach, his face pressed against the cold metal roof. He was shaking, his adrenaline spent, but a hot surge of pride washed over him. He hadn't just survived the night, he had maintained the fortress. He had looked the dark in the eye and told it to move. He climbed down the ladder, his legs feeling like jelly. As soon as his boots hit the gravel, Buddy was on him, licking his face and spinning in circles. I know, Ethan laughed, a jagged, exhausted sound. "We did it." Back inside the bunker, Ethan stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped himself in a fresh wool blanket. He felt the warmth returning to his limbs, but his mind was racing. He was starting to realize that the fortress wasn't just about the canned beans or the solar panels. It was about proving to himself that Karen was wrong. He wasn't a broken thing. He was a Miller. He reached for the recorder one more time. "Good job, kiddo," the next track began, almost as if his dad knew exactly when Ethan would be listening. "Now get some rest, because tomorrow we need to talk about why Karen was so desperate to get rid of you and what's hidden in the false floor under the cot. It's time you knew the truth about the Miller estate." Ethan froze. His hand stayed on the cot's edge, feeling the slight, unnatural seam in the wood he hadn't noticed before. The storm was over, but a different kind of thunder was beginning to roll. The adrenaline from the roof repair hadn't fully faded when Ethan's fingers found the seam. It was a hairline fracture in the plywood, tucked neatly under the edge of the iron cot. To anyone else, it was a floorboard. To Ethan, it was a gateway. "Buddy, come here," Ethan whispered. The dog trotted over, his presence a warm, grounding weight against Ethan's thigh. Ethan used the edge of the maintenance tool to pry upward. With a groan of protesting wood, a small square panel lifted. Beneath it sat a fireproof, sentry-safe box. It was heavy, the cold steel feeling ominous in the quiet of the bunker. He didn't need a key. He found a tactile keypad on the front. 0722. The code worked again. The lock clicked with a heavy, mechanical finality. Inside the box, Ethan's hands moved over thick, crisp sheaves of paper. Legal bond, by the feel of it, and a second digital recorder. This one was taped to a small, velvet-lined jewelry box. He set the recorder on his knees, his breath hitching as he pressed play. Ethan. His dad's voice sounded different now. It wasn't the coach voice from the training tapes. It was raw, heavy, with a mixture of regret and fierce paternal protection. If you're reading the papers in this box, it means Karen finally showed her true colors. I wanted to believe she'd change, but a man doesn't build a bunker because he trusts people. He builds it because he knows how the world works when the lights go out. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Ohio rain. The house on Miller Road? The one she thinks she owns? It was never hers, Ethan. I bought that land with my inheritance from your grandfather long before I met her. I put it in a living trust. For you. I left her a life estate, meaning she could live there as long as she took care of you. But the moment she kicked you out, the moment she abandoned her duty as a guardian, she forfeited everything. Ethan's fingers tightened on the recorder. He felt the thick, embossed seal on the documents, the notary public stamp that turned ink into an unbreakable law. In that box is my original will, the trust documents, and a thumb drive with video evidence of her. Well, let's just say I had cameras installed after I got sick. I knew she was pocketing your Social Security survivor benefits. I knew she was neglectful. The law in this country is built to protect the vulnerable, Ethan, but you have to be the one to trigger it. Ethan reached into the velvet box. His fingers closed around something cold and hard. A ring? No. It was a key, a heavy, old-fashioned brass key with a tag that felt like it was made of leather. He traced the indentations on the tag. It was the address in downtown Columbus, the office of his dad's oldest friend, a lawyer named Marcus Thorne. Marcus has the mirror image of these files, the recording continued. He's been waiting for a phone call from me that will never come. But if a blind boy and a dog show up on his doorstep with that brass key, he'll know the time has come to burn Karen's world down. Ethan sat in the silence, the weight of the revelation pressing in on him. He wasn't just a stray. He was the rightful owner of a $300,000 property and the legacy of a father who had played a high-stakes game of chess against death itself to protect his son. She didn't just throw me out, buddy, Ethan said, his voice trembling with a new kind of energy, not fear, but a cold, righteous anger. She stole from us. She tried to erase us. Buddy let out a low, protective growl, as if he understood the gravity of the betrayal. The plan was clear now. The bunker was a sanctuary, but it wasn't the finish line. He couldn't stay hidden in the Ohio hills forever. He had to get to the city. He had to find Marcus. Ethan began to pack. He took the documents, the recorder, and the heavy brass key, tucking them into the waterproof lining of his backpack. He checked his go bag one last time: water, jerky, the tactile map, and his dad's old Smith & Wesson flashlight, which doubled as a heavy baton. He didn't have a car. He couldn't see the road. But he had the eyes his father had spent 2 years perfecting. "We're going back, buddy," Ethan whispered, his hand finding the dog's sturdy harness. "But not to ask for a place to sleep. We're going back to take what's ours. As he stood at the heavy steel door of the bunker, looking out, mentally, at the miles of forest between him and justice, Ethan felt the ghost of his father's hand on his shoulder. The Ohio morning was breaking. He could feel the shift in the air, the first warmth of a sun he couldn't see but could certainly feel. The broken boy died in the rain 2 days ago. The heir to the Miller estate was just getting started. The bus ride from the rural outskirts to downtown Columbus was a blur of vibrations and shifting smells. Exhaust fumes, stale coffee, and the sudden, overwhelming scent of city rain on hot asphalt. Ethan sat in the back, his hand buried in Buddy's fur. The dog was a statue of focus, his harness pressing against Ethan's leg like a silent promise. When the hydraulic doors hissed open at High Street, Ethan stepped out into the chaotic symphony of the city. Navigation was a nightmare of honking horns and rushing crowds, but Buddy moved like a guided missile. He had been trained for this. He wove through the legs of hurried businessmen and around street performers until the air grew quiet and smelled of old paper and expensive wax. "We're here, Buddy," Ethan whispered, his fingers trembling as he touched the brass plaque. Thorne and Associates. The confrontation at the Miller estate 2 days later wasn't a shouting match. It was a surgical strike. Karen was on the porch, a cigarette in one hand and a "for sale" sign in the other, when the black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. She looked triumphant until Ethan stepped out of the back seat, followed by a man in a charcoal suit holding a stack of legal bond paper. "Ethan?" Karen's voice was a jagged edge of shock. "What the hell is this? I told you to get lost." "Actually, Karen," Marcus Thorne's voice boomed across the yard, "it's time for you to get lost. We've reviewed the living trust, the survivor benefit records, and let's call them security logs from the house." The color drained from Karen's face as the sheriff, standing just behind Marcus, stepped forward. Ethan didn't need to see her expression to know the world was collapsing under her feet. He felt a strange sense of calm. The fear that had lived in his chest since his father's funeral had finally evaporated. "My dad didn't leave me broken," Ethan said, his voice steady and cold as the Ohio winter. "He left me ready." Karen was escorted off the property in silence, her life estate forfeited by the very act of cruelty she thought would set her free. Ethan didn't watch her go. He turned toward the house. But he didn't stop there. Months later, the Miller estate was no longer a house of secrets. Ethan and Marcus used the recovered funds to transform the property into the Ridge Sanctuary, a state-of-the-art facility where other kids with visual impairments could learn the same survival skills and tactile mapping Ethan's father had pioneered. Buddy, now the official dean of four-legged eyes, spent his days patrolling the woods, leading a new generation of kids through the hollow. Ethan sat on the porch, the same porch where he had once been thrown out like trash. He ran his fingers over a new braille plaque on the doorframe. It didn't say "keep out." It said, "Welcome home." In the end, Ethan realized that being blind didn't mean living in the dark. It meant seeing the world through the lens of love, preparation, and the unbreakable bond of a loyal dog. A question for you. If you were in Ethan's shoes, pushed to the edge and left with nothing but a secret, would you have the courage to trust the path laid out for you, even if you couldn't see where it led? If this story of resilience and the incredible bond between a boy and his dog moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We bring you powerful stories of courage, integrity, and the quiet strength of the human spirit every week. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a journey.